About a month ago, I dreamed I was part of a crack police investigation team that was working on a disturbing case in an upscale high-rise. We were investigating an incident in which an apartment had apparently rented itself. There was a lingering suspicion of foul play, but a frustrating lack of clues. The shift came to an end with no breakthrough in sight. Leaving that day job, I moved to my night job. I was an executioner working in a ramshackle warehouse. My execution control panel was identical to the front of my current dishwasher. The quiet partner 3. My assignment that night was to execute Richard Nixon and his wife Pat. The minutes, then seconds counted down, and at the 0, I pressed normal cycle, then start, and the deed was done. Physiologically, what we normally refer to as the dream state is characterized by REM sleep, rapid eye movement, that occurs in regular cycles 4 to 6 times a night in sessions lasting anywhere from 10 to 40 minutes. There is a current television commercial for Serta mattresses in which a beaming, enthusiastic woman reports that with her new Serta mattress, she immediately enters a deep REM sleep and stays in it all night. Of course, REM sleep is in fact not deep, but is rather a brain activity state as measured by an EEG that is very close to waking life. Some believe that this is the evolutionary purpose of dreaming, a kind of sentinel function in which we are alert with many of our daytime brain functions running and poised on the waking sleep threshold, ready to spring into action if necessary. But unless and until there is a reason for crossing that threshold, we instead stay inside a world whose actuality and presence is provided not by the autonomous noise and complexity of the physical world, but by a free-form processing of the combination of recent memories from the residue of our daily life, reoccurring situations and scenarios that encapsulate our ongoing struggles and obsessions, and the whack-a-mole efforts of our puritanical self-defense mechanisms to hide, alter, or transform such combinations of those elements that it considers too disturbing or threatening to the dream ego to entertain directly. And all of this is processed in the catch-as-catch-can narrative that is a world stage divorced from physical reality, what physical reality can provide and allow. That said, I'm not really a big dream guy, and this is not really the topic of this talk. However, I think that since we all do dream, whether we engage even routinely remember them or not, it is a phenomenon that demonstrates that our ways of thinking are potentially much more fluid, reconfigurable, and potentially enlightening and transformative than our everyday use of them normally allows. In that spirit, I'm going to begin with an area of human endeavor that might first seem to be as opposite of this fluidity of dream state as possible, and that's computing. I was always fascinated by the idea of how people relate to computers that tended to be very, very shallow in a time sense. What is this thing that they're doing, and how does it connect to the human psyche in more general terms? Too often it was seen as, basically a typewriter in front of a television or some variation on it. But from my point of view anyway, and this is strictly my own unauthorized version of the history of computing, 8,000 to the present, very condensed. I'm dividing this into 3 sections: calculation as an obsession, encoding as a transformative process, and manifestation as the trail of the physical development of the structures that make computing possible. So, starting in 8000 BC, these little elements, tokens you see there, for many decades puzzled researchers in Iraq, ancient Mesopotamia, who didn't quite understand what they were. They would find them in big piles with shards of other pieces of clay. They didn't know if there were parts of some religious thing or toys or whatever. Gradually, a woman whose name escapes me, unfortunately, at the University of Texas in Austin, basically figured out how this all worked. What was going on here was that and the reason that 8000 BC is significant and maybe it was 7,999. But basically, this is approximately the time period when the transition from, you know, the hunter-gatherer or wanderer stage goes to the stage in which plants and animals become domesticated, which means you can have larger and more permanent settlements. Once you get that, what you get the birth of is basically Wall Street. What happens when you're not just gathering stuff you need to eat that night and the next morning, you have the possibility of surplus. You got an extra pig or two, or, you know, more corn pops out of the ground than you expected. So you have the possibility of either trading that surplus with your neighbor, or even engaging in you know, futures, so to speak. Once my corn is harvested, give me a pig now and I'll give you 2 bushels of corn later. The problem with this is people being who they are, liars and cheats. You have a situation where you can say, hey, I thought you said, you know, 3 bushels of wheat. You know, I said, no, I said 2. You know. So what these things are tokens. They represent transactions and quantities. So basically, you would arrange a number of them that would basically spell out such and such a quantity of such and such a thing in such and such a time period. And so you'd have this handful of stuff. Now, of course, again, people being who they are, liars and cheats, you and your friend arrange these things on the table, and then you like leave for the day, and he like, you know, puts in some more, shifts them around or something. So you got to get around that. So what they started to do around 6000 BC was to put these. You come to an agreement. You put them inside a slab of clay and make a sear out of it, so it's sealed like a piggy bank. Then someone finally figured out, well, you know, once you start doing that and you start getting these you know, people like bankers, you know, who they don't raise wheat or corn, they don't raise pigs, what they do is create transactions between people who are arranging these various trades. So you might have many, many things going on simultaneously. So you had to have some, you couldn't have a bunch of spheres that had no distinction, you had to know what was what. So they started pressing in the contents on the outside of the sphere before they sealed it up, so they knew what was inside. Then it finally dawned on someone, like, hey, wait a minute, you know, we don't need the sphere, we don't need the individual tokens, we just need one token for each kind of thing and a flat piece of clay that we press things into. And that's basically the birth of writing. But it's important to kind of note that it's the birth, that writing comes from accounting, not from the muse descending from on high. And this on the right is one of the oldest existent scraps of writing. It's 33 jars of oil. You know, it's nothing about God or the devil or anything else. Someone's into someone else with 33 jars of oil. So basically, the way I see this as these, especially calculations, especially as they relate to money and interpersonal stuff in that sense, they need to be actualized into dimensional space in some way. The abacus is around 3000 BC is a way to do that. You can offload computations onto physical objects that even allow you to change the threshold of attention. In other words, like you can move away from short-term memory by, you know, you're starting to calculate something, someone comes in and wants to buy one of your pigs or whatever, you know. You can kind of wait a minute, come back to this in a way you can't in a mental state. This, by the way, is how the abacus counts. You basically have a 5s column up above and 1s down below. It's a combination of which position they are. So eventually this is abstracted away from the physicality of the abacus to the abstraction of marks. This is the Roman numerals, which most of us are familiar with only from like the end of the movie, you know, and they say, what the hell year was that? And a lot of people think, like a lot of things they think about Romans generally, that, you know, all those dumb Romans, you know, like how can you divide, you know, MD, CC, LX, VI by LIX? Or, you know, people make fun of the Roman statues where they have like an old guy's head on a real buff body, you know, and we think, well, that would never happen, but that's not what their function was. Their function was the big cheese whose head gets to be on there, wants to be portrayed as he in fact is as a force. Anyway, what these were meant only for posting, not for reckoning. What we're of course used to is one of the most brilliant conceptual breakthroughs of human history, the Arabic numeral system, with the zero and the idea of columns. Basically, what you have with the Arabic numeral system is both a way to post and reckon. It does both by its physical position, not in physical space on the outside world, but as depicted on a piece of paper. So you can do addition, subtraction, these sorts of things in like a little machine. So you gain back some of that. Jumping ahead here now in the 17th century, Napier, and I don't know, how many of you actually studied logarithms when you were your students? You know, all the old people? No? Some? Logarithms were one of those kind of nightmares. What the hell is this? But it's really quite brilliant, which a lot of things are, I think, when you reflect back on them from school. I mean, I think now that the students should have been standing up and cheering in geometry class. Like, wow, that is fucking brilliant. You know, like, instead of, how do we have to study this? So the idea basically is to have a base, and then you use the exponent, which you can get to equal any figure you want. The reason you would do this is you can shorten some level of computation like multiplication and division, because the log of A and the log plus the log of B equals the log of A times B. So in other words, if you want to multiply two numbers, just a hairy sort of thing, you can just add their logs and get the result. And this is just an example of, 2 to the square, 2 to the 4th equals 2 to the 6th. You add them across, and that is in fact 4 times 16 is 64. And log A minus log B equals log A divided by B. So it's a way to reconfigure a calculation into literally a different mental space. And this is put back into the physical space in a slide rule, which probably most of you never actually used. Michael? Michael did, all right. Yeah, it's a badge of nerddom. I had one. They're brilliant. They're really brilliant. You can do all kinds of stuff with them, like send them into the moon and stuff. Okay, now moving more towards the mechanics of computation that starts stepping up a bit. Pascal, who's one of those kind of real geniuses, people use that term really loosely nowadays, like anyone with a brain, is a genius. But this guy was out there. His father was kind of like a tax judge or tax lawyer, and he was kind of an amateur mathematician, and he used to have these meetings with people. And he'd sit around, and little Pascal would sit there in the back with his little slate blackboard and chalk and kind of go along with him. He, again, died at the age of 39, but invented conic sections theorems, age 16, demonstrated atmospheric vacuum and pressure, was one of the founders of probability theory, any kind of projective geometry, and also helped design one of the earliest public transportation systems in Paris. But what he accomplished really was the first mechanical calculator of substance. This could add and subtract. He thought this would help Dad. Had spent a lot of time during tax time doing all these kind of calculations. It could only add and subtract, but that was a lot. He tried to be an entrepreneur and sell these things, and you think, wow, he'll make a fortune. But he sold almost none because people were afraid this would take over jobs, and there might be weird monsters in it. Who knows why? Okay, kicking this up one more step further is the German Leibniz, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. Very strange, brilliant character, mathematician, philosopher, polymath, one of the co-inventors, so to speak, with Newton of differential calculus, was very involved in the use of binary number systems, which he took from the I Ching. He's interested in the I Ching, which is, if 5,000 years old, works on a yin and yang plus system with the hexagrams and so forth. He thought this was the way to go, but he did not connect this to the calculating machine. So in a sense, there was a missed opportunity here in history that went by. But my favorite thing of him is he had this saying about, he declared that computation was unworthy of excellent men. And we'll see a lot of this is a movement in that regard. So his machine, his step reckoner, could both add, subtract, multiply, and divide. Quite a deal. Okay, so that's it for calculation. For encoding, which is where it gets very hairy. The really big breakthrough here comes from this area that might be unexpected, which is from the textile industry, essentially. The jacquard loom, at the beginning of the 19th century, arguably the first programmable machine. This consisted of a series of, at this time period, weaving was, a big thing in England especially, but France also, and the patterns that were woven became more and more complicated. This is kind of the era of paisleys and really complex designs. And again, this being the beginning of the 19th century, that industry is primarily slaves, women and children, but basically who worked long hours and got paid some gruel or whatever. And that's okay, but when you're trying to weave a paisley pattern, one mistake, man, and it's messed up. So this guy Jacquard took kind of some previous research from before, put it together with this system that essentially creates a correspondence. And I have the quote from Kant about, he's defining analogy, but it's comparable here. An analogy is not an imperfect correspondence between two similar things, but rather a perfect correspondence between dissimilar things. So what we have here is, in essence, these two things are each other. This is this, just in a different domain, which brings us to the idea of metaphor. I was in Greece one time as a young person, and I was traveling, the $5 a day kind of routine. And so you're really totally spaced out, and I end up in Greece somehow, just totally unstructured. And I'm walking around, it just looks like a big, like frat row or something. I don't understand what anything means. After a while, you learn that the P is like an R, and anyway, this truck comes by. It says metaphor on the side. I think, wow, that is really cool. Metaphor, and then of course, what metaphor means is to transfer or to move. And in fact, trucking companies, even in up till the 50s, were often called transfer companies. Metaphor just means to move or transfer. From when you apply it to the idea from one domain to another, you have what we think of in literary terms as metaphor. This is one of the more interesting objects around. This is in 1839, the year that photography is discovered, published, announced to the world. This image of Jacquard was done, kind of a commemorative thing. Took 24,000 punch cards. Those cards, by the way, are in kind of a train. They're pulled like one after another. They come down to the loom. These metal bars come down, or metal needles, and if they go through the hole, then it makes a connection. If they just hit the Ross, if it doesn't. So that's how the transfer is done. So it took 24,000 of these to create this image. And what you have here really is, again, another kind of road not taken. This is an image based on a weave that's based on, in fact, a digital manipulation. Again, it couldn't work. It was too much overhead for it to actually work, and chemical photography, of course, became dominant. But again, it's another one of those interesting possibilities. Charles Babbage, who actually was one of the owners of one of these pictures of Jacquard, is kind of our next step, and sort of now we're getting to the part of what you kind of think of as computers. In 2 steps, he created first the difference engine in 1822, and then later in 1833 the analytic engine. This is Babbage, again, one of my favorite people also. He held the prestigious Isaac Newton Mathematics Chair at Cambridge for 13 years, and in an academic's dream, he never once delivered a single lecture there, or even went there. But he was a brilliant guy. He invented, among other things, the tachometer and the railroad cow catcher, the thing in the front. He despised errors in log tables, and if he discovered an error in a log table, he'd write a letter to the editor of the London Times denouncing the author of this, as a total jerk, whatever. He also, this is my favorite thing about him, he despised organ grinders and their monkeys. He just couldn't stand them, was trying to get them banned all the time. And when he was dying, lying in his deathbed, all the organ grinders from London came outside grinding away. He was also a friend of William Henry Fox Talbot, the English co-inventor of photography. But this is his big breakthrough, 1833, when Fox Talbot, in fact, is in Lake Como getting the idea for photography. Babbage is creating what you can truly call a general-purpose machine, the analytic engine. He didn't build any of these things, by the way, because he was not a hardware kind of guy, and also, and you can kind of get a sense of it just from this picture, the calculations and computations were based on mechanical objects that operated in relation to each other, and they just didn't have the fineness of milling metal and the precision of parts that you would have needed to make the thing work. But conceptually, he had it all out. He used terminology from that time period, the idea of a store and a mill. So he's taking kind of, grinding up flour as the metaphor. The store would be like RAM, we think of as RAM, and the mill like the CPU, and the relation between them. But they were, this was not hardwired into any single purpose. So unlike the jacquard loom, which was programmable, but it could only weave, the idea with this is this could do any number of things based on your ability to configure it. He worked with another interesting person named Augusta Ada Byron, the only legitimate child of the poet Lord Byron, who was a mathematician herself, sort of, and proselytized for Babbage. There's a complex relationship between the two that's really, movie of the week kind of stuff. Her name was Ada, and it's a computer language named after her. And she said, and I bring her up because of this quote from her, Babbage's engines weave algebraic patterns the way the jacquard loom weaves flowers and leaves. Now we have one more major thing to kind of come through here, because we're still dealing with numbers essentially. This guy, George Boole, who was another bona fide genius and a child of a very poor family in London, he decided when he was just a little kid he wanted to start a school, and so he taught himself Latin at age 12, Greek at 14, was investigating mathematics, and discovered that he in fact had this great aptitude for it. And he came up basically with a publication called An Investigation of the Laws of Thought, in which he tried to propose a system for describing logical relations between things that weren't limited to numeric values. And this basically all roots from this idea of and, or, and not. And if you've ever taken a statistics class or a logic class, you're familiar with these truth tables, right? Which is, and simply means you have two inputs, 1 or 0, it's binary. And means they both have to be 1, which is true. So both false doesn't work, just one true or the other true doesn't work, it has to be both true. Or is more lenient. If they're both false, that's no good, but either one can, if either one is okay or both, that's okay. And not simply reverses the input and the output. Between these, because you start to get combinations of them, basically you can handle extremely complex sets of relationships that are in the the domain of logic, not numbers. Now moving into the 20th century, this is purely back to numbers. This is a machine that won the contest for counting the census. The census is part of the Constitution. Every 10 years there has to be a census so you can decide how many people get what representation in House of Representatives. After a while it's taking longer and longer and longer to count all the people, and so they needed to have some way to do this. They used basically these punch cards. His machine, his company, the tabulating machine company, eventually became, by merging with others, International Business Machines, or IBM, consequently the ubiquitous IBM punch card. By the way, when I was a student at UCLA in the late 60s, the way they handled registration was this thing called the run. And the run was, you literally ran between the department, the buildings where the classes where you wanted to take, grab an IBM card, and then run to your next one. So you had to, and then you turned them all in at the end. So you had to decide which one to run to first, because you had the most likelihood of getting it. And then, I don't know if people bumped each other off or anything, but we became the machine, we became the computer for UCLA, typical UCLA. And then I'll kind of skip through this because now there's big Hollywood movies about this. This was actually secret until 1970, the Bletchley Park stuff where the British were trying to break the Nazi code based on this Enigma machine, which was very sophisticated, changed keys 3 times a day, had this randomizing function. You would think it would be unbreakable, but the British put together all the most brilliant people they could find, including Alan Turing, and created this thing called Colossus. It involved 22,000 vacuum tubes and photo beaters, and were able to keep just enough close to break the Nazi code, so they basically stopped the U-boat thing going on by intercepting those. But anyway, this was the first very large-scale development of these systems. Moving to kind of post-war era, this guy, another really brilliant guy, Claude Shannon, who's basically the founder of communications theory. He was a 21-year-old graduate student at MIT working on bulky analog, kind of gear ratio, room size differential analyzers, mainly doing tables and for like shooting artillery shells and stuff. But he figured out that he could apply these Boolean algebra processes to larger scale problems, and basically invented what became the theoretical underpinnings of the telephone system. A telephone is something that it's really 2 different things. It's the actual physical set, and just by itself, it's just kind of like a party gag. It's like, Watson, come here, and it's a big joke, But until you get a network that's capable of sorting out all the requests and where they're routing to, it's worthless. It's like, it's just, so he basically provided the backbone for that. So at this, basically World War II, you get this whole bunch of different computer systems, including this guy, one of my favorite guys, Konrad Zuse, crazy German guy who developed basically one of the first computers that actually was both digital and programmable, basically without support, at least at first. He worked in his parents' garage, his parents' kitchen table mostly. He eventually did produce some, didn't sell a lot. Of course, it was in the middle of World War II, so it didn't quite work. And then I have to throw in Hedy Lamarr. This is one of my favorite stories. Hedy Lamarr, who some of you might know as, one of those old movie stars from the 30s. Hedy Lamarr is this brilliant woman who was Austrian, starred in some very scandalous movies, which are, you wouldn't give a second thought to today. But she was married off by her parents. Her mother decided she'd be the perfect trophy wife. She married her off to this rich munitions manufacturer who basically kept her as a slave, and she had to put up with dinners where Nazi guys would come, and Nazi munitioners, and they'd watch movies with torpedoes sinking ships and stuff, and she's like steaming there at the table. So she decided she had to escape, and she had a maid who was actually her guard, and she drugged her, escaped out the bathroom window, made her way to England, got on the stage, was spotted by an MGM scout, brought to Hollywood and became a star. So that's all cool, but again, she was very smart, suffered no fools, and ended up marrying this, what we call an avant-garde music composer. This guy did all kinds of pre-cage things with tape piano players and stuff, and they were sitting one time, both sitting at on the piano stool, playing kind of a call and repeat thing. They play one and then the other would echo it and back and forth. And she got this eureka idea, which was she always wanted to make a torpedo to help defeat the Nazis, you know. And so the problem with torpedoes, you know, dumb torpedoes are just like a thing with a propeller, and like there's the bad guy, boom, let's try to lead him so that it'll run into him when he gets there and that kind of thing. That's pretty crude. Next step up is to have a radio controller so that you can like direct it as it's going. Problem with that is the bad guys, knowing this, can listen in, go through the frequencies, find out what frequency you're broadcasting on, and tell it to go fuck itself, you know, blow up or whatever. So that's not good. So what she thought of was you basically had what became this idea of spread spectrum. The two things, the guy, as the sender of the torpedo, and the torpedo itself would know about this song that would go some jumping through the frequencies. They would know what it is, you know what it is, and you send it a signal, go left, go right, but it's actually being broadcast in time differently depending on where you're routed on the frequency at any one time. So the bad guys, even if they find out what frequency you're on, by the time they find it, you're onto something else, which is random, unless they know the tune, I guess, you know. So unfortunately this was, and she patented it, this is part of the patent. And unfortunately they didn't have the technology again to use paper tapes in a torpedo, so it didn't really catch on. But as soon as their patent ran out, the Navy took it over, and that's what they used. The reason all of this came to light of day was all these nerds in the cell phone industry, mobile phone industry, as this was starting to happen, and they were investigating patents as they tried to lay out their own. When you do that, you got to look through everything, right? So down at the very bottom, there would always be this patent by Hedy Lamarr, and see, her name is actually, that's her actual name, Hedy Keisler Markey. Is that the same one? You know, finally, it came to light, and this was about 1998, I think, and they tried to get her some, you know, acknowledged they wouldn't know how to do anything, and so they kind of invented their own award and gave it to her. And some reporter called her up and said, "Hey, what do you think about this? You finally got your award." And she said, "It's about time." What your comment was. Okay, and then finally, just very briefly, manifestation. How do you get all this stuff to work? Boole, who really figured out how you really work with that binary system, the thing that Leibniz couldn't really pick up, he sort of laid that out when it was kind of traveled to America. Charles Sanders Peirce, the guy we know of as kind of the philosopher, inventor of semiotics and all kinds of other stuff that makes grad students go crazy. He actually suggested linking electrical states with Boolean algebra, which is, again, brilliant. Now the only problem is to get to move fast enough, because the Bletchley Park stuff was, you know, using big vacuum tubes and stuff. It was too hot. It broke down all the time. So during the late 40s into the 50s, the technology of basically semiconductors came to the fore. The transistors. Semiconductors are semiconducting material is you know. Metals are good conductors because they contain an abundance of electrons that are not tightly bound, so they can be, like, you know, shoved and pushed along. So things like rubber or ceramics are bad conductors because they have tightly bound electrons. But special kinds of things like semiconductors, like germanium, are crystals arrayed in a lattice that can be changed depending on how you dope, what's called doping them. So they can be made essentially into switches with no moving parts, virtually almost no power, and can be, as we found out, miniaturized further and further and further. So integrated circuits by the end of the 50s, which involved transistors, capacitors, and resistors, all made of the same semiconductor material and shrunken down. And then it was just another 10 years before this young company called Intel that had a job from a Japanese company that was making calculators. They wanted to do 14 chips to make this calculator work. They brought it down to like 7 or something, and one of them was actually programmable. And from that point, you get what we tend to think of as computers coming out of the semiconductor industry rather than the old school computer industry like the IBM type stuff. So as far as the future, and this is where it gets really interesting, this is all still, it's not totally theoretical, they are doing some stuff with this. Basically, this is using the idea of quantum mechanics. So quantum particles can exist in multiple states at once. So, but theoretically, by arranging atoms in a certain way, you could actually encode via these quantum particles the little ones and zeros. And what you would have in that case is, as soon as you program the thing that you need calculated, it's done in 0 time. It's just one side of the other thing. And you have finally the solution to Leibniz's calculation being unworthy of excellent men. You have no calculation. Now, briefly, I'm going to show you, having betrayed many of my biases and interests, a brief summary of work over 40 years, and then I'll conclude with a project I'm currently working on, which is in kind of the beginning stage with maybe just a little bit of middle, beginning with a little bit of middle maybe. So I thought that would be interesting to present things that were not finished. Anyway, this is where we'll start, and because I think, I'm not a mathematician. I like mathematicians, and I like the kind of stuff they do, which is like really crazy. I was at the University of Illinois in the mid-70s, and I was fascinated with the idea of the traces that are left by people in high research situations. And I visited some labs and stuff, and that was okay, but it just seemed, it wasn't quite right. And then I discovered this place, Altgeld Hall at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana. It's one of the oldest buildings on campus. It was composed of rooms that had 3 walls of slate blackboards. Honest to God, slate blackboards. It wasn't the wimpy whiteboard or shit that passes now for marking. This is like what Pascal did, So every day, every hour, there are classes going by, and there are these guys, professors, grad students, who are, arguably trying to convey some of the most complex and abstract thoughts that people are capable of using chalk on slate blackboard. It's where the idea meets the paper, the chalk, the slate in this case. So I'd go in there, and it was like a race to beat the janitors who were coming by and like erasing stuff. And I started photographing there. Again, I'm going to really go through this quickly, but I didn't want to do a documentary sort of thing. I wanted some form of transformation to be at the heart of it. And I basically, this is still an era film, so I'm shooting 2 1/4 film, which is a strip, and normally, and this is one of the weird biases of photography, analog photography, you shoot this thing called a roll, and then you develop it, and there are frames next to each other, and that seems kind of important to me, but of course you just turn into, most of the time you just get a lobotomy at that point, and you just take out the frames you like, as opposed to working with what that strip potentially could be, because there's a temporal relationship there. And so I wanted to do that, but take it into the spatial relationship as well. So these are film strips that were put together rather than individual frames. And it was called the Mathematics series, kind of ironically, because it can't possibly be mathematics, because that's about very precise relationships between these figures. Then in 81, 82, I acquired an Apple II computer, and what I liked about that mathematics series was it took place in what I thought of as an arena. It was this place where certain conditions were there, they were repeatable, they were related to the world at large, but were a subset of it, and you could visit there. It was kind of a place, it was an ecology. I liked that idea rather than landscapes or something like that. So I turned my interest to the format of the magazine, the mass-produced magazine. And at this time, of course, it was the very, very beginning of the digitization in reproduction. And so I took this format of the opened up book, double-page spread, and I made these images that were exactly the size of an 8.5 by 11 opened up page. Called it Seattle Subtext, as the idea that these were these systems of delivering information that were eventually going to be honed down specifically to each viewer. So instead of you getting the same Time magazine that everyone else does, you would get this kind of redefined thing. And the subtitle, Seamless Recursive Autonoma, this machine that would accomplish this somehow, all imaginary to me at that point. And so it started off with the same categories that are in time, cinema, religion, except they're kind of skewed and altered, basically using strips of television imagery in the place where normally text would be, using that same technique from the mathematics series, and trying to connect this back to the idea of the construction of the magazine. This one specifically is kind of quoting Alan Kay. Alan Kay was the researcher at Xerox PARC who came up with the idea of windowing as a graphic interface for computers. His work at Xerox PARC was just absolutely seminal, and Steve Jobs visited one time and ripped it off and made the Macintosh out of it. But he's the guy who really first started it. So in 81, 82, these ideas were around. And in between the normal sections, I had these sections, which I called display. They all had the same title, display. And these had listings of all the videotapes I was making that I was grabbing frames from to make these columns. So you're kind of seeing behind, you're seeing what was possible versus what was actually brought out for you. And this was all done by hand. So it's literally on the cusp of the digital, because I shot film, I made contact sheets, I cut them up, and I put them under a big piece of glass, and then if I wanted to change something, I'd lift up the glass and move the thing and set it down. And in printing these, I stripped them to goldenrod papers, which is the same thing that used to be used to make printing plates, and printed those in the darkroom. So it was like an analog printing press. However, pretty quickly it became obvious this was all going to fall away at some point. By 84, there are enough, at least crude ways to get images into a digital form. This was I can't remember the name, but it was a board that you could get for your Apple II computer, and it would scan incoming video. It would basically do like a vertical line, and it wasn't robust enough to grab an entire video frame. It didn't have the horsepower to do that, but it could like move across from left to right and sample the frame. But of course, since it's video, it's changing over time. So this is actually like a guy hawking magazines or something, and he's looking up and down during the time that the vertical line of exposure crosses. It's kind of like a quantified Francis Bacon sort of thing. Yeah, and this guy kept popping up. This guy looks like Ronald Reagan. I don't know how the hell he kept escaping, but this is, of course, the same guy. It's just the scan was started, and it's only like a 5-second piece of videotape, but the scan was started at slightly different times. So he's Ronald Reagan on the right. He's like a kind of goat monster on the left. The format of these was in a wall, actually it's literally wall board that I covered with printouts of all those listings of videotape segments, and this was like a 26-foot run of wall, and then these individual images were brought up. The illusion was that the glass was magnifying them from what was behind, bringing them up, and this I thought of as a web, like spider web, and there's even a spider there, right? So there's this kind of crawl across them as things are brought into play. I also really like the coarseness of imagery, of the resulting translation of imagery. You couldn't like scan picture the Grand Canyon, it totally noise out. But a guy in a suit and tie always came through. In 1985, it was a big breakthrough. I thought this was like really great. 4 engineers, super nerds from the AT&T Bell Labs, the AT&T research lab, I think it was destroyed when they broke up Ma Bell, came up with this low-cost imaging board that would work in an IBM type computer. They tried to sell it to AT&T. They weren't interested, so they broke out and developed it themselves. This was affordable in relative terms to this time. A board that could actually had the horsepower to grab a video frame. It grabbed 2 fields, which became a frame. So this was great for me. This was great. I thought, because now I can photograph inside television, and that's exactly how I thought of it. Like God gave me a camera and said, go inside there now. So that's what I did, and I brought it out, and in the terms of the technology at the time, which was very coarse. These are actually very large scale, 24 by 30, you can get them up to that size, but very coarse color. You can still see the weave of they weren't continuous color. It was just like 16 colors or something. And so I did these things called cards that were kind of taken from the idea of kind of like a fruit label, something really simplified. By the early 90s, more sophisticated technologies were coming through. This is an iris print. Iris printers were developed for the printing industry as a way to create a proof, basically. You can't fire up a 6-color offset press and print one picture. It just doesn't work that way. So they did this iris printer thing that could give the client an accurate version of what their piece will look like when printed. And of course, artists gravitated towards it. This is a series called World Info. And I started with the motif this time of graph paper. To me, graph paper was clearly kind of like the John the Baptist to the Pixel Christ, like the thing that preceded it and informed it, really. And also in the idea of what was then unfolding, the interface of the face of the computer. 1998, this is a sequence that the idea was to create these cards, very simple, very noisy objects that were supposed to be kind of like sheets coming off the press of these cards before they were cut up individually. So you had to deal with all of them simultaneously. And then 2000, 2004, Warp and Weft. This is really taken from an homage to my parents, actually. My mother was a quilter, and my father was a tile setter, and it kind of dawned on me, at one point, why I'm interested in putting all these little things together, And so these are very much like quilts or tapestries, in the sense that tapestries and quilts, for the large part, are objects of remembrance. And so these were from different trips, like, see Vicky there in the center, in the middle. Trips we would take, dinners we would make, and then Vicky wandering around in our backyard in our previous house. This is a very simplified format of a large horizontal picture, a smaller vertical picture, and a smaller horizontal picture. When you put them together, this kind of bar, the vertical bar, becomes more and more pronounced depending on what the images are, but it's just exactly the same in every single one. And to me, this is much more like the way we process images in our head. They're not discrete individual things. In fact, it's very hard to do, to imagine a picture with a frame around it. You can hold it for a while, but then just, an elephant comes in or something else happens real quickly. And then at this point, around 2008 or so, I really stopped doing series, as such, and so the stuff from here are kind of different shards of things. There's one they call emblemata. The emblematas are these kind of cryptic, specifically it's these emblems that were done in the very earliest stages of book making, emblems or visual motifs, but they tended to have the format of some incredulous image, or oftentimes two different things that would be okay by themselves, but together they're like, oh my God, you're in Nightmare City kind of thing. And then there would be a text that was called a motto that would surround it. So, but they're meant to be very cryptic, and so I did some things that were variations on this. There's also a real photography thing. Like these two pictures I took just like a couple minutes apart, and this girl, she was kind of pissed off on the left and kind of, resolved on the right. And but what changed? I mean, you can't tell. This is me with my cat. Actually, with my sister's cat. And one of those eye chart things. And then cartoons are really kind of a variation of this. This one is kind of Second Life. This is one that I did for Kara Rhodes' Cutie Beauty series. In all of this, I'm still very interested in just photography. I mean, that's just kind of in part of my DNA. And what I like about photographs is how they can be just, what the fuck is going on here? Like, these people are doing stuff, and people are watching, and you don't know why or what's going on. You didn't have anything to do with it, but you happen to be there. This is quite a bit later. That was in the 70s sometime. This is 2003, downtown Seattle. I really like this picture of this guy, businessman. He's out to lunch because he's got like running shoes on, and he's having some kind of nervous breakdown. Overweight guy in the background, and people driving by, the typical city scene. And so I'm using that in part now in web work kind of things. These are just very fragmentary right now, but I really like this idea of what's generally called responsive web design, meaning you're designing for, it's not like a single picture, it's something that might be vertical, might be horizontal, might be small, might be big, depending on what device people use to look at it. I think it's a really interesting design situation. And this is the fight and flee. This is something that came to me in a dream. This fox about to pounce on a rabbit, and the rabbit says, "Don't look at me so triumphantly. I can talk." This is an I Ching that gets kind of routes through all the possibilities. Eventually, all of this will be put together on a website called Concrete Tires Rubber Highway, which is an homage to my brother, who used to say this when people would say something to him that was ass backwards. And he says it's like having concrete tires on a rubber highway. And in the meantime, there's this website that has samples of all the stuff you see. Okay, now to this current project. And again, this is kind of at the beginning, and I'm not sure where this will go or if it will go or what it's about. But this is yet another world that I want to plunge into, and I've made some kind of specific constraints to it. So these are big book catalogs, meaning Sears, Ward's, JCPenney's, although JCPenney comes late on the scene, not until the 60s, Spiegel and Alden's. These are all large scale, mostly based in Chicago. They're basically like Amazon and function that way. As an actual image production machine, it was awesome. There's a company called R.R. Donnelly in Chicago that was the company that made most of these, and these were all printed later in the 60s, not so much, but in the classic period, were printed rotogravure. Rotogravure is like etching, like art etching, different than lithography, where you're floating ink on a plate. With rotogravure, you're putting ink into depressions etched into metal, and so you have tremendous tonality. very, very expensive, but due to the way it's made, the printing plates do not wear out very easily. And so if you're printing more than 500,000 copies, it becomes very, very cheap. So they used rotogravure. They could print on really shitty paper, and they did, and still have it look pretty nice. So these were pumped out like crazy, and they definitely sold themselves this idea of, you call, you don't have to stand up, you don't have to sit on a chair, you can lay down and walk through all these catalogs and pick out the stuff you want and have it sent to you. It was also connected to the idea of the time payment plan. Wasn't the only thing doing that, but it was one of the large investors in that way of paying as well. So it was this large thing that involved thousands and thousands of people. This is pre-digital, the time period I'm using. So someone physically had to strip in all the film into all the goldenrod sheets to make the printing plates, to do all this stuff, all done by hand. And the reproduction, of course, was done but with a big camera called a process camera. No scanner. They would take a picture of the picture, the photo, break it into a halftone and reconfigure it. So just a massive undertaking. I've elected to basically take the segment from middle World War II to the early 70s. After that, it gets less interesting to me. Part of it is that I would only be familiar with the last part of it. I mean, I was born in 1948, but I didn't, at age 1, I wasn't like looking through a catalog. So there's a big part of this that I never saw directly, and then a part of it that I did see directly. I kind of like that idea. So there's a specificity of, work for victory. You can go to the Seattle World's Fair, they'll arrange it for you. This is World War II stuff, so it's kind of interesting because things are rationed then, right? So you can only get certain kinds of shoes, and you had to keep track of which shoes you could get, and you could use up your ration stamps for shoes in different ways that they'd help you out. But everything was for sale: Bibles, crappy enlargers, and arranged in a way that's just kind of beautiful, I think. It's so much broader than web pages now for like Amazon, whose point is to kind of always look the same. This was highly eclectic and evolved, and they tried different things. So something like this is much more, the science of mattresses. It's X-ray, and this is like exercise in bad taste of color. Here's, oh, you're so handsome, dear, kind of thing, and really pitched as from head to foot. But then this other stuff sneaks in, like, these guys that are like literally stuffed shirts, only they have shoes, dropped his hat. And especially in the earlier part of this, this was, in the 40s especially, this was pitched to broad areas that included rural areas, and so you could get harnesses for your workhorses, not too many of us have those now, but 2- and 3-star chickens. You could become a giant and make your kitchen shrink back down. Now, make no mistake about it, these were landscapes of desire, and they knew what they were doing. What I also like about it is that they were doing it damn fast. They didn't have like 3 months to think about, what are the kind of semiological connotations of this? It was due, it was due on Tuesday, and they had to come up with something. They would even, in some of these catalogs, you'd see the page numbers like 25, 26, 26A and 26B, because they screwed up, so they had to put this kind of inset thing in. And then the visualization is quite interesting, especially in this earlier period, because they would draw from photographs and do these combinations of illustrations and photographs, and we're constantly working these ideas of both continuous space and the abstract space of either against pure white or against this kind of seamless backdrop, nowhere kind of place. More mattress theory. Crappy TVs. And look at this remote that thing has. installations, the tools, which had to be stacked in such a way that it looked like it was sort of a wall, but it was also kind of flat. Then there's, of course, the fashion stuff, and most of the time, this tried to connect to the world of the fashion magazines, and so the motif tended to be the seamless backdrop. Where are they? They're not anywhere. They're in the seamless world. Sometimes, though, it would be narrative, like here's. First, I thought this was like a cop kind of arrest him, but it's supposed to be a ticket. It's part of the ticket-taking thing at the movies. Right? At the movies, all oriented to the viewer in this way that's really not very comfortable. And this is more extreme, but here's a school, really tough school. Like, look what happens when you get the answer wrong, when you don't know what feels like silk is cool as cotton and horses like nylon. You have to wear this severe dunce cap. And here's for the men, you get to pretend to read a blueprint and touching this like it's on fire or something. This is kind of interesting. Most things are like, wow, that's really cheap for that tube of toothpaste or whatever, but look, $56 for this hand saw that's really weak. You can go down to Home Depot and get that, something for that price now. Ted Williams put down the bat and picked up his gun. Now this next section is what my actual personal favorite is, because there were different approaches to the catalogs, even though the functionality was the same, whether it was Sears boards or Spiegels, whatever. But and I haven't been able to crack the research, the behind the scenes thing, but there's obviously someone in control of the Words catalogs from about 52 to 58 who had this very unique style of totally flattened out. This is kind of the, Sylvester gets run over by a steamroller, the Looney Tune cartoon kind of thing. This kind of flattened out thing, and there's very few actual models. This is as close as you get, these kind of stuffed people with legs. On this very clean background. Oops. This is one of my favorite things too, as a variation on the seamless backdrop. This was, again, just during this time period, they had some kind of setup where they had real grass and then a way to make a seamless from about there. You kind of see the edge of it. And so you have this really generic landscape. And again, once you leave the motif of the seamless backdrop, you get to the question of where are they? What are they doing? Why are they out there? Why do they look like nuns or whatever? It's just the intensity of this isometric version of things. So again, you get this combination of the reference to, oh, this is what my bedroom might look like, the IKEA kind of thing. But then here they are in nowhere land in perfect isometric form. So the question is what to do with these, and I basically have not decided, but I have a couple of clues. One comes from the actual structure of these books. Now this is a book, so it goes from one section to another, and mostly it's pretty obvious what section you're in. This one is somewhat unique in that these are two pages that really are across from each other, and like here's some accordions and vacuums. Like, well, what's the transition? They just had none, and they didn't have time to kind of ponder this out. But sometimes this might be the most severe case. So here's a kid on his bicycle. He's about to knock her over. Why these two together? So this is just kind of a rupture in the landscape of this space. And so I thought this would be maybe a way to approach this. And the way I could do it is through these sale catalogs. You can see here, this is the sale catalog is kind of like a branch from the main catalog. Sale catalogs, at least in this time period, were put together with staples. So they were just two-page signatures. So now I opened it up, this is the centerfold, so to speak, right in the middle, right across from each other. But in fact, by taking the staple out, you can separate them out from each other and flip them over. And so what you get is a journey through this space that starts off, and down below I have like, so this is page 88, page 89 for a total of 177, and of course it always totals up to 177. This is like the brilliant space of Gauss. This is one of my favorite math stories. Gauss is a famous mathematician. We know him from the Gaussian blur in Photoshop. He was a genius little kid, and when he was 7, the teacher, he finished his homework, really fast, and so the teacher wanted to get rid of him for a while. Said, "Go add up all the numbers add up all the numbers from 1 to 100, and come back and give me the total." And so he thinks for a second and says 5,015. How'd you do that? And he did that by short-circuiting the idea of computation. Instead of saying like, okay, 1 and 2 is 3 and 3. He just realized that, okay, 1 to 100, you threw me a softball, you have pairs, 50 pairs that total 101. You have 1 and 100, you have 2 and 99, and 3, So he just saw that, and so there was virtually no computation. Not that this is the same, but what this gives you is an offset is the difference between the distance between these two pages, even though they're physically one page, because of the way it had to be printed. So when it starts off, of course, this is what's there, these kitchen things, and then it's kind of related, okay, kitchens, and then it gets a little strange, stuff kind of behind the scenes with the living room. Then it gets a little messy, the stuff in the walls behind all this stuff. Now offset at 53, we're getting real far away. Notice also that in the kind of refined section, it has this font, and in the manly man's section, it has this font, and you can see them kind of going through each other. Okay, now we're getting very freaky because the isometric thing gets a little crazy here between these two beds, and this is definitely not true. There's definitely leakage going on by an offset of 50 or 60. Interestingly, by an offset of 80, late 80s, tires and shoes tend, for some reason, to link up. Then shoes and shoes. Creepy boys and men's. Definitely some leakage going on here. Uh-oh, got some gender leakage going on here. Don't do it. And at the end, for some reason, you have photography in the models, which is kind of, and then just one more. Same idea with the offset. This one, the offset is not all large to small. It was mixed up a little more. Some of these are blanking out. Okay, so where this is all going to end up, again, I don't really know, but I do enjoy the challenge of tackling something that encapsulates so many aspects of photography and imaging in a cultural kind of context. And so I conclude by saying that I think there are two really simple but absolutely fundamental things about the nature of photography. First, photographs resemble each other far more than they resembled the world. Second, photography historically set out to describe the world, but it ended up populating it instead. And this is most like, I would argue, an apartment renting itself. Thank you. Entertain any questions?
Actually, I have a question. When you're showing the pictures of the people with no faces and things like that, between 1945, where Montgomery Ward and Sears and Roebuck were really targeting people, trying to figure out who were they marketing to. At the same time, too, there were also a lot of black people that were starting to make money in the northern part of the world. And so those are the people that were actually buying from the catalog. And so when they didn't have a structure for a face, they were actually able to buy without going into market, department store. They found that I've read some of the articles about that. And it was Montgomery Ward to market for those type of people to buy. So I was curious. That's who they were targeting when they didn't have any faces.
Yeah, again, I'm not really approaching this as a sociologist or anything, but that's part of the landscape of it. You can't divorce that.
Right.
Which is why, again, it's an image world.
You never really saw it in Sears, but you always saw it in Montgomery Ward. When they said Ward, Montgomery Ward, they did that. They started to do that in 1962, between 1962 and 1968. That's cool. I enjoyed that.
Yeah, the farm stuff kind of fades out fairly quickly, although the only thing I ever bought from a Sears catalog was in 1963, and I had a science experiment which involved rats, and I ordered a lamp that was used to warm chickens from a Sears catalog. So as late as that, they still had at least some
That
stuff.
always reminds me of that show, I forget it, that Christmas show where they buy that BB gun. But yeah.
I have a question. I came a little bit late, so I didn't hear your introduction. Are you planning on using these physical pages, or are you using the ideas and the concept of how the catalog is created and the type of layouts and the photos to do your own photos?
Yeah, I really don't know, and I don't know that I have to even resolve that. Hey, I'm retired, dude. I can do anything I want to. I tend to think that like a web kind of situation would something where it's more ephemeral in that sense. But the physical objects, some of them, and again, it depends on the year and the company. Some of the printing, especially monochrome, it's not really black and white. It's kind of this beautiful. It's like art browns, They're beautiful and unique objects because the paper is really crappy, but it has this incredible tonality. It's beautiful.
They make good Christmas trees.
But yeah.
Did you make Christmas trees?
Oh, I should say I don't know what I'm going to do with it exactly. It's tempting to combine them in some way, but I don't want to get like a dye kind of thing or something. It seems tedious.
Well, one thing that struck me was that you're like really going modern, and then you're kind of going retro here. But I'm kind of curious when you feel like you're at the end of a series, or what makes you feel like you're at the end, or that makes you want to start something new.
Yeah, I think it's different with different kinds of things. Some you just lose interest. It's kind of you're kind of done. Sometimes it depends on the situation that changes, and you can no longer have access or whatever. But I think that's why something like this is so, it's so, even though I'm saying, okay, World War II to like 1973 or whatever, it's still a vast space. But I trust this idea that, you know, when the Target board was invented, I thought this was like this fantastic thing that I had a camera to go inside television. And that's the camera you need inside television. You know? If you had a literal camera and you went on television studio stages, it wouldn't make sense. But to take photographs inside, not just video, but what later became internet stuff. One thing I really liked about photographing inside television, like Melrose Place, you know, like photograph inside Melrose Place, you know, what do you see? You know? One of the great things about it, though, is you bypass a lot of the really tedious ontological questions about, you know, the photograph being indexical to the space. You know, it's like you grab a video frame, and it's just like the thing itself. It's not like it's apart from it the way a photograph is. You know, you mean three-dimensional space into two dimensions. You just stop the ongoing processing. So it's a different kind of thing. So somehow there has to be something like that to deal with this stuff.
Another question.
Yeah.
Since I'm standing next to someone who started photography about the same age I started, how much do you think nostalgia, your feeling of nostalgia, your age, playing?
Yeah. Oh, that's a really good question. I don't know that I can answer it, but occasionally I'll see something that is like, ooh, this is weird, you know. To give you a more explicit example of that, I was in Snohomish, that town that used to be a lumber town and that gave up, so they turned into an antique town. Antique store town, yeah. So in the basement of one of those places, they had a lot of magazines and stuff, and products, ephemera from distant times. And so I'm just kind of looking around, and my eyes cross over this thing. It's like, oh Jesus, you know. And I didn't know why. And what it was is a box with this kind of stern-looking lady, black and white, with kind of blue around, and Mrs. Such and Such bluing. So bluing agents. It still exists, actually. It's what in the old days you would put in your wash to make whites look whiter,
yeah.
you know. And it finally dawned on me. Literally, it was like waves of kind of memory. And what it was is when I was, I don't know, 3 years old, something really, really early. My mother, who had a old school washing machine and the crank thing, she would give us baths in the stationary tub that was next to the washer, and so she'd plop us down, and we'd be looking right at that bottle of bluing. That's where it was from. So it just, there's some of that, aspects of that, but I definitely went back to World War II so that there are parts that I couldn't have seen for that reason. So it didn't become a nostalgia thing, or oh, look at Fonzie from the 50s, that kind of stuff.
Are you saying you try to avoid nostalgia?
Hmm?
Are you try to avoid nostalgia? Or getting stuck in a rut?
As much as possible. Nostalgia as nostalgia. Oh, yeah, that's good.
Could you repeat that, the last couple of sentences you said of your talk there with the photography doesn't look like the real world
Oh,
itself, kind of?
yeah. This is the two things I think from teaching the history of photography for so many years. So the first is that photographs resemble each other far more than resemble the world. You just kind of start from that, and then the second, more complicated, but it has a lot to do with this kind of stuff, is photography starts off to describe the world. Now this thing is able to give us a report on the world, but the problem is it results in an object, and those objects build up, and pretty soon, they're filling up everything. You're like as a culture, we're like hoarders, we're just like walking down these aisles of picture crap that's piled up from all the stuff we're making. So I don't know what there is no kind of, and therefore, you should
I just don't
eat no cheese or whatever.
I got it, Paul. I'm gonna go write a book now. No, I thought it was really nice. I mean, it makes me think like to do something like interesting. It would be so random. It would be unrecognizable. If you saw something that was referencing something else, therefore had like no context. All of a sudden, it would be hard to catch it because it was like this thing that was just alien so far. But it's an interesting thought, but yeah. Just wanted to hear it again. I thought it was a good closing remark there.
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
So your work that you showed today, it seems to span all of these different ways of laying photos out in grid systems, like representing magazines and publications, but the technology has shifted from the 70s to now. And now, when you're looking at these works, you're talking about taking them back to or using them in the web or something. I guess that's not really a question. So the question is, could you talk a little bit about how if the technology shifts in the different decades, are at play? Or
Well, one way of approaching that might be, lots of times people say, well, why don't you do something like about the web, and I think there are plenty of people doing stuff like that. I think it's kind of, it's too close to be able to say a lot of the things that maybe need to be said about it, so I purposely decided to go back before that time, but look at things that were similar. So the big book world, with the choice, you can sit at home and take all this stuff out, and it's all kind of blended together. And I guess, if you're looking through a catalog, if you're mom, you're going through these certain pages, and then you kind of give out. Dad jumps in the tools, or whatever. There's this one book, and people are scanning different parts of it. Just very strange, And so I think you can get at a lot of things that are being played out in contemporary, web culture, without looking at it directly, which I think is. I think that's fine. I'm just not interested in it because I think it's too noisy. There's too many misconceptions that can happen. So I think
it's too noisy or too repetitive that you just see the same thing constantly. Because no matter when you open your computer or open a book, you see the same thing, and there's no really originality. Like you can look at a book from 20 years ago, and you would look at it, and people actually took the time to take a photo. It's not so much study it or present. And today, people just take a snapshot and then the picture, another photo.
Yeah, or I think there's another thing that is like, which I also like about this time period, is that these are people under pressure who are making these things, and that's like Bach, like Bach couldn't sit around, I wonder what Jesus would think. He's got to crank out a cantata by Sunday, he's got to do the thing, and so there's thousands and thousands of people who, they got to get the blender done, you got to get that goddamn thing done, and so I think in those states, things can happen that are like really inventive. And that brings it back to the kind of the dream state, which is, again, I didn't want to get too far into that because I don't really know that much about it, but I was surprised when I did kind of research it a bit, this idea that, the idea of the sentinel function, that in fact, physiologically you're immobilized, but your brain is in fact has a really nice view because it doesn't have to deal with actuality. And so more processes can actually go on than you can in the regular world. So certain kind of things can happen, and it gets complicated. In those dream cycles, there's 4 to 6 periods at night where you have REM sleep. It starts with kind of short, and they tend to be more mundane dreams or just residue from daily life, you know. Like the execution with my washing machine, you know, like it's this thing I look at all the time, you know, and how did that get there, and why Richard Nixon and Pat, but I'd heard a thing recently about Ethel and the Rosenbergs, you know, so maybe it was that, I don't know, it just kind of, everything's kind of up for grabs, you know, and it's this kind of free-form processing that I find really interesting and liberating, you know.
Speaking of pre-stage processing, it's great to see, like, you were glitching long before, you know, I actually had one of the grad applicants say, I do glitch art, and that was like, so your downloads of the video were very much early examples.
Another question, I think, I mean, seeing the work and also like the work that's here in Inca, like for example, this video outside is an analog version of, you know, something that somebody made in the 60s for the World Fair, and which I walked in and I'm like, wow, how did they do this? Like, this is crazy. Like, what did they think, you know, at the time? Because there was no digital at the time. And then, like this thing, it kind of makes sense for me to, like, even as young artists, to kind of look back instead of like looking at the new stuff, because not just there's so much of it, but because, you know, like somebody who's like a coming, you know, young student is being introduced to, for example, digital photography before darkroom, or being introduced to virtual DJ before knowing what music vinyl is, you know. So they have the software, but they don't have the real thing that was back there. So they don't really have the back.
Yeah, and there's a certain story to the physicality that you can't get. Again, I'm old enough to know that actually the very first job I ever had, meaning a job you actually had to have a Social Security number for, was at the Davis Enterprise, which is a paper in Davis, California. And it came out once a week. The text was set in lead type. And my job was to take the last week's issue, you know, all the lead slugs, put them in this big pot, like a witch's cauldron, you know, lead, you know, lead type, melt it down, and then once it was melted, scoop it up with this, you know, Paul Bunyan kind of thing, and pour it into ingots, you know, that then would go on the linotype machine. It sounds like 1864, 1964. So there's a physicality and it's not nostalgia, it's a different way of framing things that can be liberating to sort of see. Like the idea that to reproduce a photograph in a magazine, you had to take a picture of it. You already have a picture, but you have to take this specialized kind of picture, which is a separation into several parts, you know, and then reconstruct it again. It's like, that's pretty amazing, you know, like this, to be that into the syntax, the structure of what actually makes the thing. So I think, again, it doesn't have to be nostalgic or, you know, well, I guess you better throw away my, you know, digital camera and get a old school camera. It's just that you can learn something from that. You can learn bad things too, right? You see bad examples of things that they really were a waste of time, you know, just, like ferrotyping prints, or spotting prints. That's the one I'm glad is gone.
But I think what's interesting is that, you know, I see a lot of people, I shoot film, I prefer film personally, and medium format, it doesn't really matter. But using 100% manual versus the option to use automatic. And I see a lot of people who do automatic and try to make everything so perfect, and I don't think it needs to be perfect. You know, sometimes the best photos you've ever taken are ones that are slightly out of focus or soft focus.
Yeah, the problem, and just from being a teacher, is how do you frame that so that it doesn't seem like a punishment? You know, like you'll make things, you'll suffer through, you know, learning how to get this goddamn thing on the reel, you know, and all that stuff. But how can you construct in such a way that really does bring some of that stuff up? I think one of the main things is that time frame between photographing and when you actually first see evidence of that trace, you develop the film.
Right.
And you don't see the picture, you see the negative of the picture, you know. So there's something about that that's really interesting, but how do you get at it without it just seeming like a punishment?
Well, I was in South Korea a couple months ago, and I listened to this man who had to hire a translator who went all over Korea and North Korea, and he did this film. And some of the most amazing photography he did were out of focus. And I just thought it was brilliant, you know, and he was like 90 years old, speaking about some of the stuff that he took, you know, and some of it was nervously taken because he was in North Korea with a camera. And it was just fantastic. And so, you know, it wasn't one of those. He actually had to, you know, bend down and take the photo. And his work reflected in a room like this, and it was just amazing. So it was really cool.
I have a question. Right, I was really fascinated by the beginning part of the talk all about computation and thinking, and I see a lot of the connections with building systems, especially, you know, throughout the work. I was curious with this latest set, how, if you've connected that back in any way, are you thinking about it in terms of systems, like some of the Boolean ideas, some of those ideas about combinations and how we actually take logical arguments and the sort of systems, like how that kind of, how you're thinking about it now, how that is wrapping into this latest work?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I think what I did show you with that idea of the offset, I mean, is very coarse, but it's that kind of thing. It's sort of like, you know, doing a slice for electron microscopy or something. It's kind of, or an MRI or something. You know, you just kind of defeat the normal system of how they're placed together, not randomly, but because that really is one physical piece of paper, and it's an echo of, you know, the actual production of it, how you make that work on a printing press.
Because I mean, it just seems to me like you definitely, like, when you look at those juxtapositions, it is, I think, human nature to start putting a narrative and start doing this magic and pattern assembly and thinking about it actually in an abstracted way to try to make sense of it. So I think there's definitely something really fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could probably do some kind of an analysis type thing with, you know, when did they do certain things. I think that's what those designers did intuitively, you know, or did, again, not intuitively meaning like, you know, all kinds of, you know, poetic and flowers in the air kind of thing. I'm just like, it's 3:30 and you got to turn it in at 4, you know, and so you get real creative real fast, you know, and you make these leaps, and you think, damn, how do they do that, you know? There's a great story of this guy named, his name was Brown, I can't remember his first name, but he was Hollywood, he basically made movie posters when that was like a big thing in the 50s mostly, and in that kind of business, you know, you don't have like seminars and, you know, movie posters, you know, and go to retreats and stuff. I mean, it's just a job, you know, but you look at everyone else, what everyone else is going on. So they're developed this system, and all this can be tracked, of kind of this guy did the Attack of the 50-Foot Woman, that was one of his most famous ones. But this kind of central figure, and then these sub-figures are on the side, and the way that they pulled in the narrative in a certain way was something that, it was like a groupthink thing, that all of these guys together, playing off each other, crafted this thing that really worked well. It was kind of beautiful, you know. And these are again, severe deadlines, you know, that they got to crank the stuff out. And the interesting story about that guy, Brown, was he hated what he did. He thought, you know, this crap, you know, like I gotta put food on the table and pay the rent, you know, so I gotta do this. But if I really could get out and be an artist, you know, that's what I really want to do. So he eventually made enough money that he could retire, and so he retired, and now I get to be an artist. And what he ended up producing are these horrible, kind of like cowboy in the snow with his horse kind of stuff, this kind of Western Western art that was just really awful, you know. And he gave up this like kind of wonderful thing that was, again, this kind of group mind. And I think that happens with a lot of this stuff. And I think that's what you pick up on, probably, I suspect, from the individual companies and the individual time periods. If you'd actually have access to the archives, I think you could find a lot of really interesting stuff. But they probably don't, I'm sure they don't exist. They threw them